In order for a philosophical idea to change the world, it needs three things. It must be useful, so that it's materially changing the lives of people rather than just existing in our heads. It must be true, so that it doesn't instantly disappear the second someone criticizes it. And it must be spreadable, to make sure that we can get enough people to believe in it to make a meaningful change. So in this video, I'm going to explain the Venn diagram of philosophy, to explore why most ideas can only manage at most two at once, and theorize whether any system could have all three. One quick caveat before we start, these categories are not meant to be absolute. If I put something outside of useful, that's not me saying it's never useful in any context ever. I'm merely saying that it's not useful as the primary philosophy that you organize your whole life around. Likewise, if I put something outside of spreadable, that's not me saying it will never spread to anyone, it's just me saying it's unlikely to hit mass adoption. So sprinkle some nuance on there. And I think that a good place to start would be with pragmatism. Pragmatism is the philosophical position that states you should believe that which is most useful to you rather than that which is most true. A practical example of this would be with motivation. If you say to yourself, I can do anything, that is of course a literally false statement. It is not true that there are no things you can't do. However, it's still probably a useful thing to say out loud to yourself. Because that's a hell of a lot more inspiring than the reality, which might be, I have a 73.4% chance of succeeding. And so pragmatism goes in this corner because it is by definition useful but not true. And I think for that same reason, it's not particularly spreadable. Because at the end of the day, humans crave truth. And while a little bit of pragmatism goes a long way, I don't think the average person would want to live every day of their life under this system. Because in the words of Matt Dillahunty, no one wakes up every day and says, I think I'm wrong, but I'm gonna keep believing this anyway. Moving left, a philosophy that is useful and spreadable but not true is Theism, the belief in God. And I'll use Christianity for an example here, because religion is undeniably useful. Because religion can bind a community together, giving everyone a shared sense of morality and meaning, which helps cooperation and can get people through hard times. There's studies showing that rates of religion go up in times of crisis and war because people need something to hold onto to make it through these times. It can also be incredibly transformative on the personal level. There are millions of criminals and addicts who will testify that for years they found it impossible to turn their life around until they found God. And it was the belief in God that gave them the strength to finally make it out of this pit that they'd been living in. Religion is what philosopher John Vervaeke would call a psychotechnology, a tool that once you have it in your head allows you to accomplish something you'd never be able to do with your metaphorical bare hands. And so for all the amazing things I have to say about it, the problem is that theism just isn't true. We don't have time to go super in depth on this, but I don't believe that any philosophical argument for God succeeds, and I don't believe that any religion has been able to prove its historical claims. And so while I truly love religion and occasionally consider myself a cultural Christian, going to places like church for the community aspect, I just can't commit my life to it because I don't believe it's true, and there are millions who feel the same way. Although that new thing we build definitely shouldn't be bigotry, which I would argue is spreadable but is not true and not useful. The reason that bigotry can spread like a virus is because it latches on to humanity's natural want to have an in-group. It tells you that you are superior, better than an other group, and motivates you to hate them, which is why we've seen so many societies throughout history plunged into hate. Bigotry is not true. It is not the case that I am superior to another person because my skin happens to have a different melanin quality. And it is also not very useful, because if I believed that people who were different from me were worse, then I would be cutting myself off from thousands of potential friendships and connections I could be having. And speaking of severing connections, let's move on to Stoicism, which I would argue is very spreadable due to its popularity, and it even is true, but I don't actually think that Stoicism is useful. One of my first videos was actually about Stoicism, and while it wasn't very good and I might remake it, the short version of the argument I gave is this: Stoicism's theory is correct. Not a word of it is wrong. The basic idea that you should divide your life in half into things you can control and things you can't is a great principle to live by. And every idea it has about discipline and self-control seems correct to me. The only problem is that I don't think there are many people who have actually improved their lives using this system, because unlike Christianity, there just aren't thousands of institutions and communities based on this foundation. There aren't millions of people giving testimony that they turned their lives around due to this idea. A lot of Stoic books are well worth the read and can help you in some areas. I just highly doubt that the average attendee of Stoicon is significantly more happy than, say, my grandma who goes to church. A philosophy that is certainly not happy, however, would be nihilism, which, while being true, is not spreadable and is not useful. Bear in mind that here I am specifically talking about objective nihilism. See my video on the nihilism family tree to know what that means. For an example of this philosophy in action, imagine if you did something really cool, like go on a run or create a piece of art. The only thing a nihilist of this kind would have to say is that, objectively speaking, there's nothing about what you just did that was meaningful. And, like, yeah, I guess that's true. I don't believe in God, so I think that meaning is a feeling in our bodies rather than something in the world. But, like, has my life been made better from hearing that? Am I now more likely to be happy? I highly doubt that. Of course, if we were going to get into more positive kinds of nihilism, building off this idea with existentialism or absurdism, we could start to get somewhere, but as it stands, nihilism is not good for anyone, and for that exact reason, it's very unlikely to see mass adoption. And to round us out, a philosophy that is true and useful, but is not particularly spreadable, would be rationalism. Rationalism is the belief, practice, and community that you should make yourself as rational as possible, eliminating biases from your head. And I think that objectively, this philosophy is incredibly useful. Whether it's a culture of acceptance and intellectual curiosity, or amazing events, or huge institutions like Lighthaven. It is of course also kinda definitionally true, as by aligning your brain with rationality, you are ensuring that you only use the most effective methods of getting towards the truth without being clouded. Although of course we're all human, and no one is able to apply this perfectly, which is why the community, instead of calling themselves correct, call themselves less wrong. And so if rationalism is so great, then why is it not spreadable? The standard piece of advice you get to learn more about this is to read a book called The Sequences, which is 1,600 pages long. The average person is just not gonna read that shit. And while rationalists throw the best parties, if you're a little more shy or low in openness, which I think a lot of average people are, you might not get along with these spaces. And so while I think it's perfect here, it's just not realistic to expect the entire world to adopt this view. Or in other words, we have philosophies that are useful and spreadable without actually being true, philosophies that are spreadable and true without actually being useful, and a philosophy that is true and useful without being spreadable. So let's move on to the center, because I'm sad to report that I don't believe that any philosophy is there right now. The Western world used to be run on religion. The belief that there is a God who has imposed objective moral rules on us was incredibly useful for founding a high-trust Western society. It was useful for our sense of self, it was useful for our community organizing. And when we started to realize that it wasn't true with the advent of modern science, nothing else ever really replaced it. And I think that that's why we're experiencing the so-called meaning crisis in today's society, where millions of people find themselves without any point of being, without a purpose to care about, without a community that they're a part of. We have lost our philosophical center in society because we have failed to replace religion with something that can meet all three criteria. But I do think we could change that. And doing so is the mission of my channel. I make videos all the time about how we can use philosophy to improve ourselves and society. And I now have a Discord where I post exclusive content for people who are interested in helping out with that mission. Because no one person is smart enough to create a philosophy that can change the world. But together, I think that we can build something really cool.